Hello there, my name is Jordan Leroy Hansen, also known as Ledev, and I'm here to both announce that I am one of the content creators that are participating in the early access stream as of tomorrow, as of this recording. I am really excited to try out this new set. I am thankful for Wizard of the Coast to provide me this opportunity. Just, this set actually looks like a pretty fun set, especially with some of the nifty cards. So I decided for this video to actually go over some cards that I'm actually kind of excited to brew around with. I'm going to put free cards, each in each color, and then also artifacts and lands. One of them is going to be kind of like my, I think this is a competitively viable card that people should keep their eye on, while my other two are mostly people who know me. I like to do a lot of jank brewing. I like to make some really silly deck techs and such and just test out the mechanics to their fullest extent. So these are two cards that essentially when I talk to them, I'm just going to talk to them about applications of some funny silly brews that you can actually brew around them. Now some of them, there's one part where I'm going to cheat is when we start in white, because there's actually two competitive cards that I do think that needs to be talked about in unison. So with that, let's actually start off with white. So the two competitive cards that I think right off the bat that we'll see play starting in the meta, if you, to be honest, is a combination of two enchantments. One of them is Leyline of Sanctity, which we see right here. Leyline of Sanctity is a popular enchantment in eternal formats such as Modern. It's a reprint. And pretty much before this reprint was announced, I think it was going for like around $20. I mean, heck, you could even see that the Modern Masters version is still going for $20. Yet the core set is going for like $6.45 and such. So as you can tell, the prices will be kind of going down. But this is a really, really popular tech card, and I think it is going to be a very popular tech card in the standard meta. Mostly because it helps us counter against some of the more popular deck archetypes, such as an Esper Control that likes to run a lot of fodder rations and such, or even discard decks that do run that card. Pretty much anything that target a player to discard a card, Leyline of Sanctity is kind of like the perfect countermeasure since you have hexproof, so it allows to protect yourself against that, but most importantly, it helps you protect you against the mono-red aggro in the meta, since a lot of them run the very aggressive-oriented burn spells, and Leyline of Sanctity is just a perfect sideboard counter to that. Now, I think this is more going to be in the best of 3 formats rather than the best of 1 formats, because while it's a good card, it is really just a good sideboard card. You don't really want to main deck Leylines. There is one I'm going to talk about that I think is going to be the exception to the rule. We'll get to it when we get to it, but Leyline of Sanctity, perfect card. And the other one that also gets tied for, I think, going to be a competitively viable card is honestly Rule of Law. Rule of Law is an enchantment that says each player can't cast more than one spell each turn. Now, this one is a perfect counter against a lot of cards in the meta. Pretty much it counters against Phoenix decks without a sweat. It also counters against Mono Red that likes to run Experimental Frenzy, since it slows down the deck quite a bit once this enchantment's out in play. And since Mono Red don't have enchantment hate, well, yeah. So, I think these are cards that will see at least popular sideboard play in the competitive meta, in my opinion. Now, as for the two cards that I want to jank brew around with, there's actually a couple. Now, one could argue that this might actually be a competitively viable card, but it might be, but I also like the jank brewing possibilities of it, which is brought back. 2 white instant spell, choose up to 2 target permanent cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn, return them to the battlefield tapped. Now, this card is just legitimately a really silly card. Now, one of the interactions that I kind of am excited for is mostly its interaction in kind of like mid-range to aristocratic style decks that have white as a primary color. Just the fact that you can say, for example, let's say you have a sack outlet, sack 2 Fiends, get the beneficial effect out of them, then you can just cast Brought Back and then bring back those Fiends to be used for sacking later. That's actually really cool. Most people are also talking about its interaction in internal formats with the fetch lands, which, yeah, is legitimately absurd. Also, its interaction potentially for mono white lamp and standard with the cards such as Lotus Field is something to consider. We'll get to Lotus Field once we get to it, and we'll probably bring back this card. But its interaction there is pretty silly. And this might even just be a decent card in kind of like the Teferi style Esper or even Azorius type decks, because most of them have the problem of protecting their Teferi. So then they have the shenanigans of just essentially, oh, I get my Teferis back. Once they get board wiped or something like that, or they get removed by combat tricks, and it's just, yeah, that's definitely some pretty good potential. Still, I like this for more kind of like janky applications because the factor that you can return any permanent can allow for some janky shenanigans with enchantments, also just shenanigans with creatures that have really powerful ETBs. I feel like this is a card that you can take advantage of in an aristocratic style deck and actually have some really legitimate fun with. Though, yeah, it does have some competitive viability. I would be lying if I didn't say that was the case. But I do think there's some really cool jank applications to brew around this, and I'm really excited to make some decks around this card. The other card that gets the honorary kind of like jank brew mentioning is one that, let's see, I need to find it. Where is, there we go. Savala. Now, Savala, mostly, it's kind of like a big flying deck, kind of like pretty much flying deck payoff. But I do feel like flying decks are going to be a theme potentially in the meta as more of a good casual deck. And I do feel like for an Angel Tribal deck in specific, this will be actually kind of a cool little payoff, especially the factor that you don't have to pay 7 mana. You could just essentially pay basically a mana and hopefully 4 flying creatures if you have them. And the fact that it gives you other creatures you control flying indestructible, that is really, really cool. So I feel like for people who do like the tribal decks and wanted to make a tribal angel deck, that is more kind of a janky deck, if I'm being quite frankly honest. I think this is just a perfect lord for those type of decks, as well as with combination of Lyra and such. So, for those who wants to try Angel Tribal, you got a really good top-end card, in my personal opinion. Next up, we're going to go to blue, and blue, there's actually some potentially good competitive viable cards. Mostly the one that I think right off the bat will probably see competitive play day one, if I'm being completely honest. Well, this is where I could joke and say, of course Negate's going to see sideboard tech play, but as for a new card that will see play, honestly, Tails In. Tails In is kind of one of those cards where I would not be surprised if this sees sideboard or even mainboard deck play in some formats, including standard. Just the fact that it's really cheap for control decks to have this to be able to counter really annoying activate ability triggered or legendary spell, which, let's be frank, planeswalkers are everywhere in this meta. Like, legitimately everywhere. There's green that has Nissa, there's Orzhov that has Sorin, there is, of course, the Teferis, there is planeswalkers to your left, planeswalkers to your right. I mean, heck, even mono red in sideboards will run Tybalt. So the fact that you can use this to help counter against a planeswalker for the cheap cost of 2 mana, and then let's say you go against a deck that doesn't have it, well, chances are most of the competitively viable standard decks that don't run planeswalkers still run stuff that has activated or triggered abilities. So this still might be just a decent mainboard tech card just to counter those abilities. I mean, for example, Mono Green Stompy do run cards like the Brontodon to help against Artifact Hate and such, so if you have an enchantment or artifact you want to protect, hey, you can Tails In that activated ability. There you go. And then there's also stuff such as like Search for Escanta. I mean, I could go on. Nevertheless, I do think it is one of those cards that will see a lot of play competitively, in my personal opinion. Now, onto the Jink cards. This one is pretty easy for me in blue. There's just a few. One of them is one that does seem kind of mean at first until you realize the janky potential of it. Flood of Teals. 4 and 2 blue for sorcery. Return all non-land permanents to their owner's hand. If you return 4 or more non-token permanents you control this way, you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, many people who are jink brewing around this card are really trying to find a way to get 4 permanents on the battlefield that they want to bounce, and hopefully try to get a Omniscience onto play by turn 6. Which then, if you do that, then hopefully the fiends that you bounce can just be played for free. That's mostly the janky application of this card, but I do think there's some other potential applications, such as in stuff like maybe if you have Omniscience out, if you do that, maybe you can do something cute, like I would say Omniscience, and then with Flood of Tears while your opponent has their hand full, play like Awaken the Earthwire, try to find a way to do one-sided board wipe, which probably like gleeful, or not gleeful. It's the one Ixalan board wipe that had the City's Blessing mechanic that's a one-sided board wipe in that sense. I'm having a brain fart on it, but I feel like that's an approach you can go with that, and I think that's a really cute jank brew to give a shot at. But still, Flood of Teals has some potential applications. There's just some really, really silly things you can do with it if you can, quote unquote, get away with the 4 permanent clause. But on the other hand, there might be just also the aspect that this might be just a perfectly fine card to be used as a temporary tempo swing. So keep that in mind. As for the second Jink Brew card, I would feel remiss if I did not mention Agent of Treachery. Now, Agent of Treachery is kind of one of those mean, silly brew cards, I'm not going to lie. But essentially what happens is, it is a 7-cost permanent, which we're hopefully going to try to get out early with a few cards that are coming in this set. But essentially it's a human rogue, and when it enters the battlefield, gain control of target permanent. At the beginning of your end step, if you control 3 or more permanents you don't own, draw 3 cards. Now, honestly, once we get this on the battlefield, I feel like there's just a lot of silly applications since we have a lot of clone cards in the meta. We have stuff like Quad's Duplicate, we have Spark Double. I feel like if you can find a way to get this out early, which once we get to black, I think there is a cute little card to help you get this card out a little early, I feel like you can do some very silly shenanigans with Agent of Treachery, just with the Quad's Duplicate cause, to even make it where you might be able to do the second part of that test a lot more easier than you think. Also, I think this might be just a cute card to put in like Simic, Matt's manipulation type decks, because most of them will ramp up to the point that they can cast this for 7 mana, and if they do have like a mass manipulation scenario, if they already have some permanents, then this could just be used as a semi-decent card draw engine. Yet, this is still kind of one of the meaner cards to Jank Brew around, but I do think you can have some fun if you're more into the thievery aspects of Magic the Gathering. In regarding game mechanics, of course. Yes, I will talk about Artemis at the moment. Honestly, yes, that alternate win condition is hilarious, but I do think, besides maybe if you want to go like, okay, this is really janky, it's a hard card to brew around. You really have to, like, many people want to try to do the alternate win condition, but I feel like it's very, very unlikely. And the main reason why I think it's very, very unlikely is because in Magic, when you want to hold cards in your hand, you're either playing control or you just don't have the mana to play the cards in your hand. And in Magic, you kind of want to play cards in your hand to help keep board presence, help keep tempo. I mean, if someone on stream wants me to try to brew around this and try to get this to win, I'll try it. But it is kind of one of those, I think it's going to be one of the harder alternate win conditions. And for me, personally, I think it's kind of impossible. And this was the guy that tried to make a modern Hedron alignment Triskaidekaphobia deck a thing. So, just keep that in the back of your head. Anyway, after that little part, I'm actually now going straight into, I believe, black. Perfect. So I could talk about the one competitively viable card that also is going to be kind of my favorite Jank Brew card as well, which is Blood for Bones. 3 and a black for a sorcery spell. As additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. Return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, then return another creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Okay, let's get the thing out of the way. I know many people were both very excited for this card, and then their excitement kind of went down a little bit once they saw the reprints of Leyline of the Void, which, yeah, that is a competitively viable card that is going to see play because the factor that many modern players had desired for that reprint and such, as well as Grafdigger's Cage. Here's the thing, though. I think those are cards that are going to be seen play in best of 3 in Arena. I feel like it's going to be very, very unlikely unless the Sultai Dreadhorde and any other reanimation deck becomes super, super popular. I don't think it's going to see much tech play in best of 1. So with that in the back of your head, so to speak, I feel like this is a really fun card to actually play with in best of 1, and actually you can make some really great, silly reanimation brew decks with Blood for Bones. Because one of the things that many people have pointed out, and it's a great thing to point out, this doesn't target anything. The bad thing with most reanimation spells in general is if you try to target, most of them have it where you have to target the card or target the creature in the graveyard. And the thing is, most people can easily kind of like hate out that card by just saying, oh, okay, I am going to exile that card from the graveyard, and then the spell fizzles. This one, all you have to do is just resolve the spell cast, and then you don't target anything. So unless they run like a Baron Moore like at instant speed, which I don't think there's any way that I can recur in the meta to play lands at flash speed, so yeah, there's some very few interactions that will interact with you being able to return stuff. And even then, I think the one thing that people are not realizing, this is kind of a white card in the sense that you can use this as a reanimation spell to get some big stuff, such as that thief we were talking about earlier in blue, which, yes, I'm going to be brewing around that. Don't get me wrong on that. But I think you can also use this as just simply a flicker spell. If you have a creature already on the battlefield that has a significantly powerful ETB, like, say, a Chupacabra, or maybe even one of the Explorer creatures in the meta, you could just simply sack that creature, return that creature to the battlefield, and then just use the secondary effect to return a value creature from your graveyard into your hand to play for later. And just with that, I feel like just the applications of this card is silly. So yeah, I think it's going to see competitive play in best of one, best of three maybe, but I'm definitely sure best of one in Arena. Now, as for the Jink Brew cards, okay, this one's pretty easy for me. One of the Jink Brew cards I kind of wanted to brew, even though most people are saying that this is mostly a competitive viable card, but I also like it for Jink Brews. Dread Presence, 3 and a black, whenever a swamp enters the battlefield under control, choose one, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Dread Presence deals 2 damage to any target, and you gain 2 life. Now, most people have already pointed this out, and I will point this out as well. This is a card that seems like you want to play like a Gugari or maybe even a mono black deck that has like Chromatic Lantern, just so that you can cast Scape Shift and then just go off with just essentially playing a bunch of swamps and then just triggering this multiple times. And the fact that you can have multiple copies on this on the battlefield and do that trigger effect is just hilarious. I feel like many people are going to try this Scape Shift kind of brew. It just seems really fun. And the best part about this card, even if you get away with the trigger only once, one trigger off this, both in limited and in constructed, is perfectly fine. That's what you expect from a 4-drop like this. So, honestly, this is a card I am really happy to drink brew around, especially with Scape Shift and such. And the other one that I am curious about Jink brewing around, and many people, depending on who you ask, some people are saying that this is going to be a good card. Some people are going to say this is a bad card. It depends on who you ask, but Scheming Symmetry. Scheming Symmetry, besides having really gorgeous art, has the ability of being a 1-cost tutor that choose 2 target players. Each of them searches their library for a card, and then shuffles their library and puts that card on top of it. Now, tutors that are really, really cheap are things you gotta keep your eye on. Now, yes, technically speaking, the tutor also applies to your opponent, and chances are your opponent are going to choose something to help sabotage, especially if they know what your overall deck design is. Probably something that's going to sabotage your game plan. But, as many people point out with this card, there are ways to essentially break the symmetry, whether you're using Little Teferi, Teferi Time Raveler specifically, to make it where you cast this sorcery at the end of their turn so that you get the beneficial effect from the tutor first. Or maybe you run something like Ashiok, you do the tutor, and then you Ashiok the card that they put on top. But even then, most opponents will know what's coming, so they're going to make sure that they don't tutor something that they don't mind being, well, exiled with Ashiok, so you gotta keep that in mind. But still, I always want to keep eyes on these cards because cheap tutors in Jank Brews are something you always have to keep your eye on, especially for combo decks, because most combo decks, their main struggle is trying to find all their pieces, so they either have to A, go through a very aggressive draw engine to try to draw into the combo pieces to activate the combo, or hopefully have a curve that activates the combo naturally, or B, have tutors. And tutors are really hard in the meta previously because most of the tutors were relatively expensive, like going from Diabolic Tutor, which is like around 4 mana, to even like, oh, the one that had the really good Liliana art that I always forget the name of, where you put a card from both into your library and graveyard. It's I'm forgetting it right off the bat, but most of them were very high cost to see competitive play, or even to see Jank Brew play. Scheming Symmetry kinda falls on the opposite end because it's cheap. So hopefully, if you have a way to quote unquote draw the card you tutor right after you do it, you might be able to activate combo decks a lot more frequently in these colors. So that's something to keep in the back of your brain. But it's a card I'm excited to brew around, even though legitimately I think this is also a perfect card for WotC to design, Wizard of the Coast specifically, to teach at least new players the lesson. Don't presume your opponent is not going to try to counter what you're doing. Or don't presume your opponent is not going to counteract what your plays are. Basically, to put it the nicest way, don't presume your opponent's a bad player in Magic. That's pretty much the basic way to put it. And I think this card will be a perfect teach card for that specific lesson for some players. Next up, we go to red. And I feel remiss if I didn't talk any about the genres, but I do think one of the genres are going to see competitive play without a sweat, and that's genre Awakened Inferno. A 6 mana genre that can't be countered. Its plus effect allows to be pretty much give each opponent an emblem that at the beginning of your upkeep, this emblem deals 1 damage to you. -3, Genre Awakened deals 3 damage to each non-elemental creature. -X, Genre Awakened Inferno deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker. If a permanent dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead, and its loyalty it sits. Now, this is a card that I feel like if Marduk control or even Gritz's control needs a top-end card, this card is legitimately perfect. Because one, all those effects are relevant into control to mid-range deck archetypes, as well as the plus essentially is kind of a victory condition in a sense that it puts a timer on a control player's clock. For most control players, they try to dirtle the game as long as they can. Like, everybody who played Arena probably at least once played against the dirtly Teferi, I don't really have a win condition, I'm going to dirtle and hopefully mill you out. Chandra, on the contrary, is kind of the card that will say, okay, you can try to do that, opponent, but I am going to dirtle you, and I am going to ping you, and ping you, and ping you, and if you don't have any significant life gain, you are probably going to lose. So, this card is a perfect tech card against those type of archetypes and such, and I think will definitely see competitive play. I would be surprised if it didn't. Now, as for the Jank Brew cards, actually we're going to go back to Shana for my favorite Jank Brew card, though many people have been saying that this will actually see some competitive play. Shana, Acolyte of Flame. 1 red and red for a legendary Planeswalker Shanra. It has a 0 loyalty to put a loyalty counter on each red Planeswalker you control. 0, create a 2/2/1/1 red elemental creature tokens. They gain haste, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Or -2, you may cast target instant or sorcery card with greater mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard. If that card would be put into your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Now, all of these abilities on Shanra, as for a person who likes to Jank Brew, are perfect. The 0 ability, yes, for many takes, it's just essentially you're plussing Shanra herself, but there's a lot of red-centric color planeswalkers that I would not mind putting an additional counter on. Mostly like Angraf, or even like Nicol Bolas the Dragon God, or maybe even Nicol Bolas the Awaken. There's even just other jankier shenanigans. Like, you can see all the red kind of like planeswalkers. Like, even with Tipple, just putting an extra counter on it so you can make an extra little devil creature, that's also relevant. That's just going to be fun just to jank brew. Maybe make a mono red Super Friends type of deck with all the genres and also like all the powerful red planeswalkers and such. Or even ones that have splash of red and such and splash of another color. That would be a fun one to jank brew around thanks to Chandra Acolyte of Flame. Also, the 0 ability is relevant. Create 2/1/1 red elemental creature tokens. They gain haste. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Mostly when you get effects like this on Chandra-like cards, mostly they exile the token, but this one actually sacrifices them. Which means one of the decks I was considering jank brewing around with is making an Elemental Aristocrats deck. And one of the cards that I think would be perfect for that deck is this card, because that zero ability is just very relevant. You create two 1/1s that will automatically can either be used as sacrificial outlet for a sack outlet, or it can just be used as maybe for a beneficial death trigger that you have on a card, like let's say Midnight Reaper, or say, well, Judah doesn't count since it doesn't activate it on token deaths, but stuff like, say, like, oh, I'm Cruel Celebrant. Yeah, Cruel Celebrant is also something to consider. So just with that outlet alone, and if even if you're running an elemental deck, maybe you'll provide elemental synergies with the fact of the two red elemental creature tokens that you made. And the -2. You may cast target instant or sorcery card with greater mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard. If that card would be put into your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Never underestimate cards that allow you to cast cards from your graveyard. Just many people know this effect with Snapcaster Mage. Even the fact that if you ultimate like the Dominaria Jaya, you get your spells at flashback. The ability to get the tempo advantage from being able to cast your spells from your graveyard is nothing to sneeze at. I think there's a potential that this might even see play in mono red just because of that -2 personally. But I do also think there's some very janky like shenanigans you can do with copy and spells like Expansion Explosion, and then just essentially casting a card from the graveyard, then cast Expansion to duplicate the spell, or stuff like that. I mean, heck, I think one honorary mention I will mention before I go that might synergize very well with this card is, let me get to it, it's Reverberation something, if my memory serves me correct. Aha! Repeated Reverberation. Now, this one I feel like was going to have some very silly synergy with the Shanra Acolyte of Flame, since, oh hey, you cast this, have Shanra on the field, and then you minus genre, and then you activate the minus genre twice, so then you can either just essentially then cast two cards that are cheap from your graveyard, which is something to consider. It's not the most perfect combo, I would say, especially with many combos that people are thinking about with the route. Is it Expansion Explosion, kind of like do Infinite Peens deck that people are considering, but I do think that synergy is a cute one to mention. Now we go on to green. Green, for competitive viability, I feel like it would be hard to miss to talk about. Let's see. It's around here somewhere. Yeah, for competitive viability, Shifting Ceratops. This one is kind of a no-brainer as a really, really good tech card. 4 mana for a creature that can't be countered. And as many people have been pointing out, this is going to be the Teferi killer for mono green decks to have, because the factor that they can cast this on turn 5 as when Teferi Hero Dominaria is cast, and then just give this haste, and then be like, Floop! And the fact that it's protection for blue is very nice. I think this card will see a lot of competitive play, because it's also, even just not being a Teferi killer itself, it's just a nice, versatile green creature that mono green stompy decks I think are going to enjoy playing a lot. Now, as for the Jink Brews, this one I feel like is kind of a no-brainer for me, and I think it's one of the more main deckable ley lines that we got in this set, which is Leyline of Abundance. 2 green and a green for a enchantment that has, if it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield, like with ley lines have, but whenever you tap a creature for mana, add an additional green mana. And then it has an 8 activated loyalty, or 8 activated ability to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. Honestly, I see so many people that are kind of thinking this card's not that great. On the contrary, I think the card is actually surprisingly really, really good. And the reason why, at least in this current meta, because the thing is, we have a lot, and I mean a lot of mana dorks in the meta. We have Llanowar Elves, we have Incubation Druid, we have Heritage or Paradise Druid. We even have the fact that Nissa will make your lands into elemental creatures, which then tap for mana because they're still lands that still activate with Leyline of Abundance. I just feel like with so many synergies with that, you can do some silly ramping shenanigans. Plus, there's an infinite combo that people mention with Gauntlets of Light and Incubation Druid, along with Leyline Abundance, so I would feel remiss if I didn't mention that. So yeah, there is a way to get infinite mana. But even then, like I said, with most ley lines, the main cost of ley lines in general is you don't really want to top deck a ley line. I feel like Leyline Abundance is kind of the exception to the rule. And the main reason why is, yeah, it's not going to feel fun top decking this, but here's the thing. It's a card that you can still, retrospectively speaking, still play for quote unquote free. Because here's the thing. Let's say you tap your lands to cast your Leyline Abundance. If you still have plenty of mana dorks out, you're going to pretty much get your mana pretty much back from the lands you have to use to cast it through the mana dorks that you are going to tap for the additional mana. Now, I'll be frank, I don't know if this would see play in, say, a multicolored deck, with the exception of the Selesnya deck that's trying to do the Gauntlet of Light combo. But besides that, I think this is just a perfect card in a mono green ramp deck. I think it's a really great card, and I do think it's going to see mainboard janky deck play. I am legitimately serious about this. As for the another pretty much my honorary jank mention, let's see. This one is always hard to remember what this one is. Where is it? Not the Hydra. Yeah, it's Nightpack Ambusher. Nightpack Ambusher is kind of one of those cards where most people liked it when they saw cards like the Arlen Core from the War of the Spark were jokingly about thinking about making a Wolf tribal deck. And I feel like this is a perfect lord for the Wolf tribal deck. The fact that it has Flash, and the fact that it gives you Wolves and Werewolves, which is not relevant in Standard, but maybe relevant in Eternal formats, get +1/+1. And the best part is, it still generates value even if you're not able to cast spells by just generating a token. I like this card a lot for if people want to make the Werewolf tribal, Wolf tribal deck be a fiend, especially if you go Selesnya to have like Tosamir Friend of Wolves and all that. So yeah, I'm definitely going to Jink Brew around this card and make kind of like the Wolf tribal deck. Now, going to multicolor, this one's pretty simple. The most competitively viable multicolor card, I think personally, is honestly Lightning Stormkin. Lightning Stormkin has two relevant abilities. It has flying, it has haste, and you can cast it for 2 mana. I think for any aggressive blue tempo deck, or even just like the Atali kind of like aggro deck that you see sometimes on Arena, they'll be playing this card. It's just a perfectly fine 2-drop that if you're playing Izzet and you are going aggro tempo, you're going to play this card. I would be dumbfounded if it doesn't see play. At least in no specific decks. Also, another one that I think will see competitive play, and legitimately will see competitive play, is Corpse Knight. Black and a white for a zombie knight. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. This one, this is going to be very perfect in go wide decks like the knight decks like to do. Pretty much the Orzhov Knight decks are going to like this card a lot. It's a knight, also benefits with History of Benalia, just being able to ping your opponent for little points of damage. So once the History of Benalia goes off, then maybe you can try to get closer to lethal. It's a perfect card for those decks. Now for gold, there's not really many janky brew cards. Well, yes, besides the obviously commander-centric free color wedge ones, which there's definitely some janky brews. Like with Kefis the Hidden Hand, I think this one's going to be perfect to try to make a legendary tribal deck silly, kind of like in Standard. And I got one already ready to brew and try out during the stream. But it's just a fun card, just being a legendary creature elf advisor. Legendary spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And exile 2 legendary cards from your graveyard until in a turn each legendary card in your graveyard gains. You may play this card from your graveyard. Honestly, just a perfect card for those kind of like legendary mana type commander decks. But also, I think this is going to be just a fun, janky deck, since we are still in a meta where there's a lot of legendaries in the meta. So I can't wait to brew around this. Also, the other one that I think people will be like, yeah, you're going to jank brew around this. Yarok the Desecrated. It's Panharmonicon on a creature. And it's a better Panharmonicon. So it's a legendary creature, Elemental Horror, for 2 and Sultai colors. It has Death Touch and Lifelink. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent, you control the trigger. that ability triggers an additional time. So, one thing with Panharmonicon, it only affected permanents of artifacts or creatures. This one does say permanent, so this actually synergizes with landfall triggers. Like, let's say the most popular standard one is Evolution Sage. The fact that you can proliferate twice with your the Desecrated and Evolution Sage on the battlefield when you play a land is absurd. Also, the fact that this affects enchantments as well is also very cool. So maybe you can, for example, like maybe if you splash white with this, you can maybe play like an Oblivion Ring type of card that we have in the metas. Like we have a lot of them, like Itzalon's Binding and such, and maybe be able to snag two fiends, which is really really cool. And also just a lot, and I mean a legitimately lot of powerful ETB effects that we're getting both from the core set as well as already in standard in general. I mean, if you want to tell me, let's say you're the person who opens your pre-order packs and such, and you only pull like Yarok the Desecrated and such, and like maybe one other Yarok the Desecrated, and not many other cards you want to brew around with, but you're trying to think of a way to use your old collection to brew around this card. Here's the first tip I'm going to give you. Find the deck synergies that have Surveil and Explore. I think a Surveil Explorer janky deck can be brewed around Urot the Desecrated, because there's a lot of powerful ETB effects in those mechanics themselves that you're going to have a little bit of fun toying around with. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. But as long as this card is in standard, I'll probably be brewing around it because it's just fun to have double into the battlefield effects. It's just really fun to mess with. Now, as for artifacts, this one's also going to be pretty quick. This one I'm going to talk about the free cards. The one that we'll see most likely competitive play is Graph Digger's Cage in sideboards because the Graveyard Hate is good. Especially the factor that you can also play cards from your library, which does counter against Experimental Frenzy, which is nice. The one honorary jank mention, even though it's not going to be in a format I play personally, is Colossal Hammer. 1 mana, equipped creature gets +10/+10 and loses flying, and the equip cost is 8. Now, most people are talking about this card for potentially the brew in, say, the most popular deck that people want to brew this card around with is in Infect or in Modern because of cards like Sigarda's Aid. And while I don't play much Modern and I do find this combo kind of hilarious, I feel like this is going to be a combo that's going to be kind of a turn 1 deck, a turn 1 week 1 deck scenario where people are going to play in week 1, and then once people realize the trick, it's going to be easily hated out and probably going to lose popularity, in my opinion. Because honestly, we have a lot of artifact enchantment hate in the modern meta, or even in eternal formats, such as Force of Vigor, Natural's Claim, Thoughtseize, the list can go on and on. But I do feel like I need to mention this combo, because the combo is pretty cute, like putting a turn 1 Glistener Elf, or the one core that I always forget the name of, and then turn 2 Sigarda's Aid, and then Sigarda's Aid make it where your equipment's into the battlefield equipped to a creature. Play Colossal Hammer then as your second card, equip it to the Glistener Elf, and then deal 11 infect damage, which allows you to do a 2-turn kill. That is a funny combo, but I do think it's going to be hated out once people realize it on turn week 1 kind of scenario. Now, as for the card that I think it's both competitively viable, but also it's going to be fun to jank brew around, Bag of Holding. A 1 mana artifact that, whenever you discard a card, exile that card from a graveyard. 2 mana, tap, draw a card and discard a card, and then 4 mana, tap, sacrifice Bag of Holding, return all cards exiled with Bag of Holding to their owner's hand. Okay, this card is really, really cool. Now, one thing I think this card does have some slight competitive viability, because the factor is, we are in a meta where fodder erasure is mostly everywhere. So the fact that you can use this to help protect your cards against fodder erasure by just hiding the card under this artifact once the opponent hates it out, so you can use it for later game card draw, is very, very, very significant. So I think more combo decks are going to try this card out to help protect their combo pieces and such once they try to get like fodder erasure out or Thoughtseize out in eternal formats and such. That's something to keep in mind. And the fact that it's 1 mana is very significant. And even without that many synergy at all, the fact that it's a 1-cost artifact that just essentially whenever you have mana to sink into it, you could just loot. That's a really good ability. The ability to loot on this card is significant. And one of the things I think I'm going to drink brew around with this card is one that I already made, which is like a storm deck where you essentially you play all the discard spells that are in the meta, and then just essentially try to make a really big bag of holding so you can get a really big hand to sack into, so that you can go off with a storm combo. That's kind of the one I've been brewing around for a janky brew to show off at the stream tomorrow. Honestly, I'm just really excited to play with this card. I do think it is a card that might also see some competitive viability just because hand hate is a very popular mechanic that people like to play with, and the fact that this is a card that is a really decent tech card against hand hate is really cool. Now, granted, in Eternal formats, I will feel remiss to not mention Force of Vigor and Natural Claim, etc., etc. But still, even if you use this as a way to semi-protect your cards and just loot, I think it's perfectly fine. Now, the lands are going to be pretty quick to mention. There's only a few. One thing I will feel that I'd like to mention is the Con tap lands are coming back into the mana, which is perfect. This is a perfect budget land option. Dismal Backwater, Bloodfield Caves, Rugged Highlands, Blossoming Sands, Tranquil Cove, even Scoured Barrens. These are ridiculously perfect tap lands that if you're playing a multicolored deck and you're on a budget with your wild cards in Arena, these are a perfect inclusion, especially if you're more of a mid-range deck. I would not recommend them, like say if you're a aggro deck or a deck that relies heavily on your curve. But if you're playing more of a mid-range to a control deck and you're on a budget, these cards are fine. Also, the temples are back, such as Temple of Silence, Temple of Triumph, Temple of Malady, Temple of Mastery, and Temple of Epiphany. These cards are legitimately perfect tech cards if you are playing the mid-range to control game as well. Yeah, they entered in tap, but that scry ability is significantly powerful. So if you're in a mid-range to a kind of like control deck, you're in these specific colors, you're probably going to play these cards. Now, the one card that, in the last card I will mention for today, and the one that I want to drink brew around so much, Lotus Field. It's a land that has hexproof, it enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, sacrifice 2 lands, which is oof, but when you tap it, you add free mana of any color. This card is legitimately really, really silly. I feel like there's a lot of potential funny applications you can do with this card, in my personal opinion. One of the applications that I kind of want to do right off the bat with this card is honestly, like we mentioned before, one of the white cards brought back. Let's say you're playing a mono white deck. You could actually play a mono white ramp deck by just essentially play a white source of mana turn 1, white source of mana turn 2, then on turn 3, play a Lotus Field, make sure you tap 2 white mana before you play the Lotus Field, then you cast Brought Back once this land enters the battlefield and you sacrifice the lands, and then you brought back your 2 lands, so then on turn 4 you have access to, presuming you don't play a land, about 5 mana. That's actually pretty significantly really silly. And I feel like there's also other really silly applications, such as its interaction with Blood Sun in the meta. The factor that Blood Sun allows us to enter in the battlefield tap, sure, you lose the hexproof, but if you're playing Blood Sun, chances are you will not mind that interaction because, hey, people can't feel to ruin it and such because they lose their ability to do that. Now, it can still be land hated, like with instant sorcery spells that do land hate shenanigans or enchantments, granted, but with the exception of a few decks around in the meta, that doesn't see as much play as you think. Who knows, maybe Lotus Field might be the one card that helped bring it back into the meta to be a lot more significant, especially if this sees more popular standard play. But I do think this is a card I really want to jank brew around. It's kind of simple, it's to the point, it's just a nice ramp card, and honestly, sometimes a nice ramp card is what you need. Also, its interaction in any monocolored decks, I think even with the potential tempo loss of it entering the battlefield tap, is still something to at least be very considerate of. And with that, that's the cards I'm personally excited for playing with within the core set tomorrow. Now, for those who want to catch the stream tomorrow, I'll be starting the stream at 8 o'clock tomorrow as soon as the beta starts. Now, I'll be going in kind of like 2 to 3 hour cycles with the stream, so I'll be streaming like for about 2, maybe 3 hours, and then I'll take like an hour break because, life obligations and all that, and then I'll go back to it with brewing and such, and also trying out the draft. With that, I hope you all have a lovely day. This is LevDev, signing out.